The Bad Boy of Boxing by Dan Parker. Lee Omer, the least orthodox but most colourful of pugilism's recent discoveries, slugged his way from prison cells to ring prominence and profits. There was no sleep for the inmates of the Michigan State Prison at Jackson on the night of December 8th last. Two of the institution's distinguished alumni were fighting at Madison Square Garden that night, and by special permission, the entire prison population listened to the ringside broadcast. Many convicts had been around 6 years previously when Frank Trzaskowski, that wild Ruski from Detroit, had lost a prison bout to Napoleon Mitchell, a big coloured boy. Now Trzaskowski, under the name of Lee Omer, was a Garden headliner, and Mitchell was on the supporting card. The convicts groaned when Napoleon met his waterlock in the first round. But the night was saved for dear old Jassisen Tech, as the old grads call their institution, when Omer, in the main bout, gave Tammy Moriello the worst beating of his career. Lee Omer made good not only for Jackson Tech, but also for himself that night. For the first time in his life, he could survey with pride a job well done, and enjoy the rewards of honest effort. Behind him, forever, he hoped, was the nightmare of life in a cage. He was finally on the right track for the first time since he began his career of crime as an incorrigible boy in Detroit 16 years before. And if all these new inducements to keep straight weren't strong enough, he had a still more powerful one, in the knowledge that one more serious brush with the law would make him a fourth offender and send him back behind bars for the rest of his life. Lee Omer has had enough names during his 29 tempestuous years to supply a regiment, but the name that fits him best is the one his parents gave him at the baptismal font. He was called Frank then, and Frank he still is, to an amazing extent, in discussing the most intimate details of his life. "Why shouldn't I be?" he inquires. "I've lifted myself out of the mess I was in. Maybe my story will help others." Lee Omer neither looks nor acts the part of a fighter outside of the ring. There is even less about him to suggest the chronic jailbird. He's handsome with regular features and a set of pearly teeth. He's well-spoken, and his generosity is already a legend on Jacobs Beach, bivouac area of the New York fight mob. Detroit sports writers who have known Lee since his early boxing days say he was just a wild kid who got so hopelessly entangled in the meshes of the law that he gave up trying. Not until 2 years ago, when he was released from prison on parole the last time, did anyone really guide him in going straight. The progress he has made since may be of interest to criminologists. He has settled down with his showgirl wife to enjoy the normal home life that was denied him in his youth. A baby daughter who arrived on January 7th has given him another good reason for keeping straight. Omer, the stir champ, is one of the two top civilian contenders for Joe Louis' title. His style of fighting is unique. Picked up in various prisons, it has proved most effective. Lee walks around his opponent with his arms dangling loosely at his sides, and stabs out unexpectedly with punches that pack dynamite. He can assimilate punishment, and he shimmers with colour. Frank's parents, born in Kiev, Russia, came to America before the First World War, when Prohibition descended on the United States. The Trzaskowskis were raising 3 children in Detroit's boisterous west side, workers who crowded that section of the city, wanted their liquor. And Lee says his father found out that more money was to be made by catering to their thirst than by labouring. In this environment, the three Chajevsky children were reared. Two of them, Helen and Leo, managed to rise above it and grow up normally. Frank, the wild one, became so incorrigible that at the age of 13 he was sent to the Lansing Boys Vocational School for 9 months. He has spent more than half his time since then behind bars. Frank was a stoop-shouldered, frail kid. The only effect of his 9 months at the vocational school was to make him wilder. 1 month after being released, he was back under sentence of 3 years for stealing money from his parents and running away. Lansing Vocational turned Frank loose at the age limit of 17. Schooled by boys he had met there for a career of crime. With the best of intentions, his father sent him to Munger Intermediate High School. But Frank now wanted only to run wild. While my father thought I was in high school, he recalls, I was hanging around with 2 young hoodlums in my neighbourhood. One night, in 1933, when the banks were closed, and Detroit was using syrup for money, 2 pals and I broke through the skylight of a drugstore and took all the scrip out of the cash register. The drugstore was the first of a row of stores and business places that took up the whole block, with a bank at the other end. We decided to do the whole row. With an axe, we would break down the cellar door, leading from one store to the next, cleaning out cash registers. This went on without a hitch until we bumped right into a night watchman. We trussed him up, and then, while one of us stayed with him, the other fellow and myself went on with the job. About 5 minutes later, our pal joined us, saying the watchman had promised not to holler if he wasn't harmed. There were a lot of angles we hadn't learned. All of a sudden, we heard the watchman hollering, "Help, police." In a few minutes, police car sirens were screaming from all directions. We ran. I carried a valise with $7,500 worth of scrip in it. We all headed for the roof. The other 2 guys ran one way and I headed toward the bank. We had agreed, if there was any slip-up, we would meet at 6 o'clock the following Monday morning at the corner of Michigan and Gilbert Streets. So, I showed up there. The police also showed up and grabbed me. At the station, I found cut that the cops had caught my 2 pals, and they had told everything. While out on bail, awaiting trial for burglary, Frank was seized with an overwhelming desire to get even with a detective who, he says, spat in his face while trying to get the story of the scrip burglary out of him. He took his father's revolver, went to the 6th Precinct station, pointed the gun at the detective and clicked it twice. It was empty, but this crazy piece of business got Frank from 2 to 5 years in the Lonia Reformatory. On the burglary charge, he was put on probation for 3 years. At Lonia, young Chajevsky's destiny caught up with him. After he had been there a few months, a boxing team was organized, because it would mean better food. He joined, though he had no interest in boxing. To qualify for the team, he had to try out against a tough guy named Pogota. He amazed even himself by holding Pogota to a draw in 4 rounds. Boxing shows were held every Monday night, the inmates paying 25 cents admission. Under the name of Young Chajevsky, Frank won the middleweight championship. Then he added the light heavyweight and heavyweight titles to his string. 2 years passed, and then came the comparative freedom of a parole. Back to Detroit went Frank, this time with visions of earning an easy living as a boxer. A barder who had some connections in the fight game agreed to manage Chajevsky, but told him to pick a name that the fans could pronounce. Frank lived in St. Lawrence's Parish, and the name Lawrence Parish immediately suggested itself. But thinking Lawrence Too hard for a fight fan to pronounce, he shortened it to Lee, and emerged Lee Parrish, the extra R being telltale evidence of his lack of schooling. Lee Parrish's first assignment was a 4-rounder at the Dearborn Arena, and he prepared for it by purchasing 41 cents worth of tape and bandage. Arriving at the fight club, he found he was billed for a 6-rounder. When he climbed into the ring and confronted a big, ugly-looking fellow, he was all for vaulting the ropes and ending his professional career before even starting it. Appearances can be deceiving, however. The ferocious-looking fellow jabbed Parrish with a left. Lee, shutting his eyes, threw a blind right that hit his opponent on the jaw and knocked him out. Parrish went to the box office to collect. His envelope was marked $140. Sticking out of it was a note which read, $1 has been deducted from your purse for a license. Then he tilted the envelope to let the roll slide out. The roll turned out to be a quarter, a dime, and a nickel. Lee looked at the envelope again and saw a decimal point that he hadn't noticed before. His purse was $1.40. Outraged, he complained to his manager. Squawking already, eh? The barber rasped. And I didn't even take out my own cut or your seconds fee. You were fighting on percentage, you know. Prize fighting as a means of getting rich quick lost its allure after Lee engaged in a number of other bouts for sums ranging from $10 to $15. So he decided to chuck it and go to work in a motor factory. But after 1 week, he drew his pay and quit. With the money, he went out to do the town with 3 lads from his neighbourhood. One of them proposed that they stick up a meat market, the owner of which always carried a big roll. One of the guys didn't ring true to me, but the other 2 okayed him, so I figured I had him wrong. The job went off like clockwork and we got $1,200 off the butcher. After divvying up, we went our ways, separately. But the fellow I didn't trust asked me where he could see me later. I told him I was going to the midnight show at the Roxy Theatre, and he said he'd see me there. At the movie house, I took a back seat, hid my dough inside the sweatband of my hat, put it on the seat next to me, and fell asleep. The feel of cold steel against my nose woke me up, and there was a dick pointing a gun in my face. I spent a year in jail awaiting trial because I couldn't raise bail. When the case finally came up, the fellow I had suspected turned out to be a stool. When the case was tried, Lee got 1 to 4 years in prison. That made him a 3-time loser, and as such, liable to an additional sentence. Father Balsa of St. Lawrence's Church interceded with the judge in Lee's behalf, stressing his childhood environment. The judge agreed to give Lee the minimum additional sentence if he would plead guilty. So Parrish threw himself on the mercy of the court and was sentenced to serve from 4 years, 11 months and 29 days to 10 years as a third offender, with recommendation that he be paroled after 1 year. However, there was one more little matter. Because Lee had committed his latest crime while on parole from the reformatory, he was sent back to Ionia to serve 2 years left of his parole period before going to state prison to start the 2 other sentences. After the 2 years at Ionia, where his boxing improved greatly, he was ready for the state prison at Jackson. When he won the white heavyweight championship of the prison, he was welcomed into the inner circle and taught the various methods of beating the state out of time. One of the most popular of these was getting pie-eyed on homemade hooch. Fortunately for his vital organs, a call came from Lonia Reformatory for Frank to return and act as its physical director. He was assigned to duty in the hospital as an inmate nurse. The food and 190 proof grain alcohol seemed like ambrosia and nectar. After the hooch and rough fare of Jackson Prison, Dr. Victor F. Glynn, the prison surgeon, thought so much of Frank's work that he promoted him to the post of surgical nurse. In this role, Krzyzewski handed the surgeon his sterile instruments and learned anatomy. When Dr. Glynn lost his secretary, he promoted Frank to the job. Then, at the end of a year, recommended that the parole board let him out again. 3 months after he had been released on parole, Frank was drinking in a tavern with a hoodlum friend who presently became involved in a fight with another patron. When 2 others piled onto Frank's pal, Frank sailed in and flattened all 3 of them like palm trees in a hurricane. Then someone tipped him off that he had committed the social error of knocking out the police inspector for that district, so he departed. "I went home and forgot all about the incident," explains Frank naively. "But a few days later, my house is surrounded by police cars. The inspector had found out who I was. When the judge learns I am a prize fighter, he slams me back into Lonya as a parole violator. I got my job back with the doctor, and at the end of 60 days he recommended me for another parole. So I was let out on a 3-year parole by the board." Frank found employment at a motor plant for a time, but decided to return to boxing. Obviously, he'd need another new name. Looking out the window, he saw a moving van labelled Omaha Trucking Company passing and hit on the label Lee Omer. Frank was successful enough as Lee Omer for a while, knocking out his first 3 or 4 opponents in Marigold Gardens, the Chicago North Side Fight Club that developed Barney Ross. One night, Lee knocked out Altus Allen, a giant Negro, in the first round. It was an important victory, but Lee was too fresh out of prison to care for anything except a good time. Instead of cashing in on his opportunity, he checked out on a binge that left him in no shape for his return bout with Allen. This time Lee was flattened in 4. That's what the record book says. Lee says he took a dive. In fact, he insists that every knockout charged against him up to the time he met Tammy Moriello for the first time, some 17 in all, was a dive. Sometimes he says he was paid more for going in the water than for the fight itself. Whatever the facts, it is true that Omar never trained for his bouts, but drank and caroused until he acquired a reputation among promoters as a thoroughly unreliable fellow. Unable to get work around Detroit or Chicago, he went to New York to try to induce Joe Gould to manage him. Joe lost interest, however, after he had his doctor give Lee a physical examination. Omar went back to Detroit and married his showgirl sweetheart, Estelle Wasielski. Just to add spice to his honeymoon, Lee interfered in a private brawl and had the back of his neck sliced like a sirloin steak for his pains. While he was nursing the wound, a neighbour hoodlum asked him for a loan. Considering the fellow a poor risk, Lee says he turned him off with the suggestion, "Why don't you get it off that guy Steve down the street? He has 500. "How can I get it off Steve when I don't know him?" demanded his panhandling pal. "For all I care, you can hit him over the head with a lead pipe," said Lee. How was he to know the fellow was literal-minded and would do exactly as Lee had jokingly suggested? And how was he to know that when arrested, the fellow was going to blame him for having egged him on to waylay Steve? Lee had time to mull over these questions back in dear old Jackson Pen, where he was sent once more as a parole violator. When he applied to the parole board for release at the end of a year, he was told that unless he could get someone in New York or some other distant city to vouch for him, he wouldn't be let out. The parole board thought that if Lee got away from his old environment, he might be able to do something with his messed up life. Omar gave the name of Tex Sullivan, Gould's partner in the management of fighters. The parole board accepted Sullivan's pledge to see that the fighter reformed. That was in January 1943. Since then, Omar hasn't even been bawled out for parking in a restricted area. Under Sullivan's management, he fought 17 times in 1943, mostly in small clubs, and knocked out 9 opponents, won 5 decisions, lost 1, and was knocked out twice. Lee still wouldn't train seriously for his fights, but such was his natural ability and so puzzling his unique style of fighting that he had little trouble winning. Last year he had engaged in a dozen fights up to the end of September, and had won all of them but one, when word came to him that he had been signed up as a substitute for Joe Baxi against Tammy Moriello 2 nights later in Madison Square Garden. He could hardly believe the news at first, because he had been acting as Moriello's sparring partner for the Baxi bout until a few days before this, when he had twisted his ankle. Thrilled by the news, Omar hustled off to a Turkish bath. He was 10 pounds overweight, with only 1 day in which to prepare. He knew he couldn't do much to improve his condition, but he realised that the big chance of his life had been dumped into his lap, and resolved that this time he wouldn't muff it, even if he had to drop dead in the ring trying. And that's what Omar almost did on the night of Friday, September 22nd, last at the Garden. Omar floored Moriello in the 2nd round. From then until he himself dropped from utter exhaustion in the 8th, he didn't let up for 1 second. Moriello won the fight by a knockout, but Omar won the crowd. Boxing writers can't recall any other fighter who has jumped from obscurity to prominence overnight by being knocked out. His return bout with Moriello marked the first time in his career that Lee Omar entered the ring in good physical condition. The results were so amazing that he decided there must be something to the foolish business of training, after all. In fact, he was so sold on it after beating Joe Baxi, another leading contender, for a fee of $19,000, that he worked himself down to the bone, preparing for his 3rd bout with Moriello. Yet finally drawn though he was, he rallied superbly and almost redeemed the fight. He had Moriello helpless at the final bell. The result is that today, Lee Omar ranks as one of the 2 outstanding civilian contenders for the heavyweight title held by Sergeant Joe Louis, and has enough lucrative bouts lined up for the outdoor season to ensure his financial independence. So, with a fine new home and a pretty wife and a cute little daughter to brighten it up, is it any wonder that Lee Omar, who found himself at an age when most fighters are finished, has decided that breaking jaws has it all over breaking laws as a means of earning a living,